Is Project Motor Racing realistic? Which simulators does it compare best to or even beat out? Well, in this video, after 24 plus hours of testing, hot lapping and car setups, I'm going to tell you what I think of the realism and physics in Project Motor Racing. Remember, you have to be a subscriber to have the ability to unsubscribe when I say something you don't like, so sub to unsub. Click the like button if you enjoy racing simulators, hair loss and general despair. And as always, thank you so much to channel members, Patreon members, supporters and donors. Really appreciate you keeping the lights on. Some really good news. After testing and messing around with things quite a bit, I have to say Project Motor Racing does have some really interesting physics and driving mechanic behaviour, and it's definitely much more on the realistic side than it is the unrealistic side. Before going into the sort of nuances and aspects of the handling that particularly stand out and that I notice, I first want to compare it to other simulators and where I think it fits in, or what simulators it's closest to in handling dynamics. That way, if you've already played a game, you'll be like, oh, okay, it's similar to that. Great, I know what to expect. And the more that I play this, the more that this to me feels relatively similar to Automobilista 2, or that is by far the closest simulator to the nature of this simulator. However, there are some fairly large differences, and crucially, this doesn't have some of the annoyances that I personally have with Automobilista 2. The most notable one is that when locking up under braking, or if you brake a bit too hard and you do lock up, the tyres don't just insta turn off in this. They will lock up and you will have to be careful, but this is way more forgiving over the limit, and the grip returns from locking up way faster. So it doesn't feel like you're going to get into those locked, uncatchable braking slides that happen in Automobilista 2 that are very, very annoying. Crucially as well, unlike Automobilista 2, the vehicles in this are way more balanced and way more neutral in behaviour. What I mean by that is in Automobilista 2, the driving technique is to plough deep into the corner, slam the steering and welly the throttle and then wiggle the wheel like a lunatic, because that will pretty much always be faster. Whereas Project Motor Racing, you're going to be doing a lot more balancing between the pedals and the steering wheel, and maybe leaning on the fronts more subtly, and crucially using the sort of momentum and inertia of the vehicle through the corners, rather than feeling like you're just driving by removing the grip off the rear. The cars in this don't feel like completely solid planks. They feel more like vehicles that have functioning suspension, drivetrains and diffs. And also, when you change the setups, they seem to affect things in a more natural way. It's hard to explain without you trying it, but it just doesn't feel as kind of simplistic and stale as Automobilista 2 does. This feels a lot closer to the nature of the vehicles as they handle in AC1, AMS1, R-Factor 2, you know, what I would consider much more realistic simulators. Now, it is worth saying though that the sim does really want you to push hard, and you can't really get away with absolutely ragging the tyres. And I would say as well, this is super forgiving when you go over the limit. I wouldn't call it arcadey or simcade, but it is the case that the grip does return very quickly when you go over the limit, and probably quicker than any other simulator on the market. I know some people will go, well, that's arcade, but if you've driven a real car on a track, even briefly, tyres do actually tend to spring back into grip. So I'm not even saying it's unrealistic, but it certainly stands out as being quite different to other simulators on the market. And then because of the sort of controllable slip of the cars in this and how much it allows you to drive aggressively, this drives absolutely nothing like iRacing. If you try and approach this like iRacing, you will be woefully slow. If you do the brake, lock steering angle, trail brake through corners, you're not going to have a very good time. You really do need to be actively pushing the cars in this, getting onto the tyres, and then balancing them with the throttle, with the steering wheel. And I actually think it is really quite fun to drive this. Like, it's a really nice and active sim, but not overactive to the degree that AMS2 is. Personally, I find AMS2 and Project Cars 2 and the older Madness Engine games, I find them a bit of a chore to drive. They're just too overactive. Whereas this is still quite active, quite aggressive in how you have to drive, but much more toned down, along, as I say, with more of the mechanics that you expect from those established proper hardcore PC simulators. Just for those of you that are on console as well, this absolutely destroys, it's not even close, destroys your Forzas, your Gran Turismos. You know, this is on another level. This is like proper PC simulation that you're going to be getting on console. So I think that is actually a really important point to make. You really kind of have to think of PC and console separate. Console gamers haven't had proper simulators for a long time. I mean, maybe Project Cars 2 was there, but, you know, that was a long time ago. That, and also that's a lot less realistic than this. ACC, but it's mostly dead online, so you can't really play it that well. Also, it doesn't run too well on console. And then the original AC, which is fantastic on console. I've got it on the PS4, but it's, you know, it's like the bare bones version of the game. It feels great. Actually, does feel better than this, the original AC, but you can't play it online. It's dead, and the console version is even worse than the PC bare bones version. So, you know, on console, there really isn't much. You basically have this and Rensport that are trying to be more on the hardcore sort of PC realistic simulation side of things. And I would say this is at the top right now from everything I've tried on console. Crucially as well, the force feedback in this is really quite nice and detailed. Again, very similar to the force feedback and feel that you'll get in Automobilista 2. You can dial it in from the game, you can tweak it. If you've watched our live stream, we spent like 7 hours messing around with force feedback settings. You can just jump in and play it. The defaults aren't terrible, but it is worth probably tweaking them. We'll do a force feedback guide at some point. Subscribe so you don't miss that. But yeah, the force feedback, again, very similar to Automobilista 2. You can feel what the car's doing. You can feel the oversteer. You can feel the understeer. You can feel track details. Direct drive wheel, it will break your wrists. I think there's some adjustments they could do. You could just tone the strength down. Might be worth you trying this on a lower strength if you've got a high Newton meter wheel at first. But yeah, you can dial it in really nice from the game. Don't even need to worry about your wheelbase having crazy stuff either, because this game actually allows you to really adjust the force feedback quite extensively, which is, I think that's really awesome. That you know, it's all in the game. I wish other games did that. And on console, no other game has that adjustability for the force feedback. So if you've got a nice direct drive wheel or just a nice wheel or any wheel on console, this will be the game to really put your wheel through its paces. On PC though, as I say, very much like AMS2, I will say the force feedback nowhere near as good as the original Assetto Corsa, and it does have some quirks to it. You can sort of dial it in and tweak it. Nowhere near as good as I think AMS1 gives a very pure force feedback signal. And I also think that iRacing, despite its physics not being the best, iRacing does have very good force feedback using Marvin's force feedback app, or if you've got an AccuForce wheel or telemetry wheel with those settings. But yeah, so really quite good, like really high standard. Now, can't be too positive as always. I will say with the physics, this does unfortunately have a degree of that Automobilista 2 kind of floatiness feel to it, and also sluggishness in some ways to the response of the car, the suspension and the grip coming and going. It is still a little bit vague and floaty. It doesn't have that absolute tightness that you get from Assetto Corsa 1, Automobilista 1, Richard Burns Rally, and even iRacing Under the Limit. There's a sort of tightness there. That part of that's from force feedback, but also part of that is just from the tyre physics. This is sort of a little bit spongy in handling at times. So it doesn't quite feel as snappy and hooked up as I would personally like it to feel, but I don't find it annoying. I find AMS2 like weirdly vague and just sloppy in how you're sliding around. And I think really with this, because the cars are, as I say, just the balance of them is better. The way that you're actually end up driving them, even when you're pushing this and driving it aggressively, and even if it doesn't feel like it's biting into the track under the limit as much as I'd like those initial grip levels, it still feels balanced. You can still feel what the car's doing, and it's still very satisfying to drive fast. Then, separate to all those points, I think we were meant to be negative here, but some stuff I do notice that is really positive, that I've not seen in other simulators to the degree that I noticed in this, are things like how tyre temperature affects the handling, but more specifically short flash heating. So if you overdo one corner, and then how that one tyre affects the handling of the car through the next 2 or 3 corners. By the 4th or 5th corner, it's probably come back down to the normal temperature. But the way that the flash heating of tyres affects the handling is quite interesting, quite subtle, but could have quite a big effect if you're racing and the car in front makes a mistake, and then they're going to be a bit off for the next corner, so you might be able to do a move on them, taking advantage of them struggling with the tyres. Maybe that's more obvious in this game because some of the handling's a bit more drawn out, or maybe it's just better physics and more complex physics. Either way, I think it's quite a fun dynamic that could play into things in a positive way to make the racing more interesting. Oh yes, as we're on the curb, that reminds me, there is a thing in this game where the curbing does seem to unsettle the car a lot. And we're talking sort of Assetto Corsa 1 curbing stuff here, though it's more subtle in some ways in this. In AC1, if you go on the curbs through long corners, the car will just go and you won't catch it. In this, the curbing seems to hook the car through the corner a bit and pull it through the corner if you take a lot of curb. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily unrealistic. That is a behaviour you can see in real cars in some ways, and some ways not a behaviour you'd see. I do feel, though, you might be able to exploit some aspects of the curbing in this for lap pace, in terms of using the curbing to rotate the car a bit more aggressively than you probably should be able to, and then counter-steer that, taking advantage of how controllable the cars are over the limit. So it does depend on the curbing from track to track, how much you can take advantage of that. Obviously it depends on your suspension settings as well and setup, but yeah, the curbing in this definitely does pull the rear of the car around quite aggressively, and you have to be very careful on the curbing. It's something to be aware of, and again, something quite different, not something I've noticed in AMS2, more along the lines of AC1 actually, weirdly. On the subject of setup as well, a great thing with this I noticed, myself, I'm not a big setup guru, but sadly I have learnt the basics of car setup really nicely, partly because the force feedback's quite good in this as well. You can quickly change the setup and then feel what has changed in the setup very obviously, and how the car responds and drives differently from setup is really, really obvious, and that's great. Like, I notice in some simulators, especially sims where you can't handle the cars properly at and on over the limit, it can be really vague what you're changing the setup and how that's affected the vehicle. Whereas for me, I found this, and only really Assetto Corsa 1, where when I change setup, it's immediately really, really obvious what change of the setup has done to the vehicle, and then maybe how much I need to change it just from how it feels. So I think that's a really good sign as well. Now, I'm not sure if the setup options in this are good, or if you'll be able to exploit things, but the basics of what you'd expect the setup stuff to do works intuitively as to what you'd generally expect. I guarantee you there'll be like weird exploits you can do. For the hot lap stuff we've already done, for the challenges that are there, we've set the fastest times in the world, obviously, for all the challenges, because we're the best. It's not because people aren't taking it seriously, they're just testing. It's because we're the best. But for those challenges, we basically did the whole thing of lower the car to an absurd amount, stiffen the car up to an absurd amount, make it really quite oversteery, you know, the sort of rather cheesy car setup stuff that you probably wouldn't run in a race. And maybe that it probably won't be the fastest, you know, ultimately when you have proper people doing the hot laps. But, you know, those kind of bit cheesy sim setup stuff seem to work quite well in this. But they probably would work quite well in real life, to be honest. If you don't have to worry about damaging the vehicle, you don't have to worry about the car bottoming out. You don't have to, you know. So, yeah, I think that's a really good sign. Lastly, as it popped into my mind, another big thing with the physics in this that you notice is the nature of the engine braking. The game does allow you to engine brake very aggressively. It actually has a setting to stop you accidentally downshifting, sort of a shift protection. But you can turn that off. You can then engine brake really aggressively, and you will find that that will sort of rotate the rear. But it doesn't just insta-spin you off. It will like put the car into quite a severe angle. I mean, it will spin you off if you really take the biscuit with it. But you can engine brake quite aggressively, but you can also use that engine braking to set the car up into a corner. I could see how some people might be able to cheese that, again, for some esports type approaches. But it just stood out as quite an interesting difference in behaviour with engine braking. Some games, Rensport for example, you can just ignore you can just ram down through the gears, no worry in the world about the back coming out. This is in some ways a bit like AC1 with the cars that don't have shift protection in AC1, where you can really lean on the engine braking, but you have to be a bit careful, but it just tugs the car quite a bit. You'll also feel it in the force feedback, really obviously. But yeah, no, so anyway, ultimately, sorry for wittering on in this, apologies for not really being directed to the point with stuff, but I think this is a really great showing. I think the main thing is at the moment there's that CPU issue on the PC side, so the game is running very poorly relative to my system spec. Developers said day one patch for that. We'll have to wait and see, obviously. There's some issues I think with AI, but fundamentally the force feedback and handling I think is really quite good. And I think the litmus test is that I've actually enjoyed it the more I've played it, which was the opposite with Automobilista 2. And even for me, like LMU, I actually started to like it less the more I played it. Not that LMU's bad, quite like LMU. I don't think it's a bad sim. I'm just a bit bored of modern GT3 cars and what have you, so that's more to do with that. But yeah, no, it's fun. That's all that really matters. I think the driving mechanics in this are fun. You can always hyperfixate on what's more or less realistic. You know, this behaviour, that behaviour, this sim does this sim does that. At the end of the day, who really cares? Is it fun? And I actually think the driving in this is fun. So there you go. There you go. Let me know what you'd like more coverage of with the game in the comments section, and I'll try to get those videos done. We're doing lots of live streaming. As I say, we did 10 hours, 7 hours today, 10 hours yesterday, 11 hours the day before that. So we're pumping the hours into this. And we'll catch you in the next live stream probably. But until then, thank you for watching. Happy tea drinking. Take care. And goodbye.